Until I was around 26, I lived in a coastal town. My neighborhood was about a 15-minute walk from the shore. I'd say that roughly 70% of my personality revolved around the beach. I've been surfing since before I could talk, and it would be odd if I shook out a pair of shoes and didn't find sand pouring out. My two closest friends, let's call them Ethan and Leo, were outgoing, sociable, and full of energy. We were all 18 and pretty much obsessed with meeting girls. It was a Saturday night in late April, just a few weeks before school ended. Senioritis had hit us hard, and by then, my friends and I were regularly testing how much we could get away with without getting into trouble. We had already secured our college acceptances, so high school wasn't a priority anymore. Ethan and I had plans to meet up with two girls from our school, who we'd been getting along with pretty well. The plan was to pick them up in the evening and enjoy a cool, breezy night on the beach. We had blankets and a few bottles of wine, the perfect setup for stargazing. Though I don't endorse drinking and driving in any capacity, I was just a reckless kid back then. I arrived at Lily's house just after 10 p.m. She and her friend Claire stumbled towards the car, obviously having had a few drinks beforehand. Ethan and I exchanged excited looks. It was going to be a fun night. I chose a scenic route to a remote beach. The drive took about 30 minutes. The entire time, the four of us were laughing and chatting about mutual friends and random topics. At one point, Claire and I had a deep conversation about the nature of time and death, which added an oddly philosophical tone to the evening. The beach I chose had a narrow dirt road leading to it, where we could park the car. From there, we walked along a steep, sandy path that led to the beach. I chose this spot because it was secluded, and we were less likely to encounter other people. Additionally, the beach was far from the main boardwalk, so the sky would be clearer for stargazing. I parked the car as far up the dirt road as possible, and we all got out. Ethan and I carried the blankets and wine. I'll skip the boring details, but after a few hours and an empty bottle, Ethan and I found ourselves drifting apart. He and Claire walked up the beach, while Lily and I wandered in the opposite direction. After putting some distance between us and the others, I laid out the blanket, and we drunkenly collapsed onto it, eventually dozing off. Before anything else happened, Lily suddenly stiffened. At first, I thought I'd done something wrong, but then she whispered, "Do you hear that?" I focused my attention and strained to hear anything other than the gentle crash of the waves. I assumed she was just tipsy, but then I heard it too, a faint mechanical whirring like a small engine. The sound seemed to be moving, and I couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from. Then, just as quickly as it had begun, it faded into silence. "It's nothing," I reassured her, eager to continue what we were doing. And so we did. But soon after, as I was shaking out the sand from my shirt, Lily, still lying on the blanket, let out a sharp scream. I spun around to look at her and saw her pointing upwards. I looked up, but at first, I saw nothing but the dark sky. I sat down beside her to get a better view and was horrified to see what she had been looking at. From her angle, the full moon was perfectly aligned with a drone hovering directly above us. It lingered there for a few moments before darting off into the night, vanishing from sight. It all clicked. The noise we'd heard earlier had been the drone. I felt a wave of anger at myself for not realizing it sooner, followed by a sickening dread at the thought that we'd been watched. I glanced at Lily, who had buried her face in her hands, sobbing. I did my best to comfort her before suggesting we head back to the car. When we reached the car, Ethan and Claire were already there, looking confused. I quickly explained what had happened, and they were just as shocked as we were. The carefree mood was completely gone. I started driving towards Lily's house in silence, trying to lift the spirits with some small talk, but it didn't work. The girls admitted that they didn't feel safe going home just yet. Since it was still Saturday night, I didn't mind staying out late. I asked if we could go to either of their houses, but they both shook their heads, saying their parents wouldn't allow it. My house was also out of the question for the same reason, as was Ethan's. I suggested that Ethan call up Leo, which he did. Leo's house was huge, and his parents were always cool about having people over. It seemed like the perfect solution. We arrived at Leo's house, and Ethan, along with the two girls, made their way to the front door. I told them I'd catch up in a minute. I needed a moment to process everything that had just happened. I was more shaken up than I'd let on, so I leaned my forehead against the steering wheel and closed my eyes, trying to calm myself down. Those few seconds with my eyes closed really helped. Instinctively, I pulled out my phone, which I hadn't touched since the incident. The screen lit up, and there was a single notification. I had to blink a few times to make sure I wasn't imagining it. My entire body went cold as I read the message. AirTag detected moving with you. Every ounce of calm I had regained vanished instantly. We were being tracked. I snapped out of my daze, jumped out of the car, and started frantically searching every inch of the vehicle. Nothing on the front bumper, nothing in the grille, nothing at the back. Desperation set in as I flipped the floor mats and checked the seats. Still nothing. Sweat was pouring down my neck as I dropped to my hands and knees, checking the underside of the car. When I reached the driver's side tire, I felt around the wheel well and found it. A small device taped securely to the underside. It would have been impossible to find if you didn't know what you were looking for. I held the AirTag in my hand for a few seconds before throwing it to the ground and smashing it into pieces. Whoever had watched us on the beach with that drone knew exactly where we were. I didn't feel safe standing alone in Leo's driveway. I grabbed one of the shattered pieces of the AirTag and sprinted to Leo's front door. I showed everyone what I had discovered, holding up the broken AirTag as proof. They were even more horrified than I was, especially the girls. They checked their phones and found the same notification. Leo was particularly furious, realizing we had been tracked to his house. After the panic subsided, we spent the rest of the night in Leo's basement, where we ended up sleeping over. A few weeks passed, and nothing happened. My friends and I were relieved to forget about the whole ordeal, assuming it was all in the past. One Sunday morning, about 3 weeks after the incident, I got an urgent call from Leo. He was practically screaming for me to drive to his house immediately, so I did. When I got there, he was standing in his driveway with a look of deep concern, holding what I initially thought were papers. Upon closer inspection, I realized they were photographs. As I examined them more closely, my stomach turned. They were pictures of me from that night on the beach, grainy and dimly lit, but you could clearly see Lily and me in compromising positions. I was disgusted, and I could only imagine how Lily would feel when she found out. Not knowing what else to do, we called the police and explained the situation. They told us there wasn't much they could do, but we insisted they at least scan the photos for fingerprints. A few days later, they got back to us, saying the prints turned up nothing. Lily was terrified that whoever had sent the pictures might try to blackmail her, and I shared the same fear. The experience was utterly traumatizing. Fortunately, nothing ever came of it, likely because we had involved the police. However, Lily was never quite the same around me after that, and I can't blame her. All I can do now is hope that those photos never resurface. My best friend Leo and I were 20, and though it might sound a bit conceited, we both came from well-off families in Northern California and spent our summers down by the coast. My family had a place in Santa Cruz, California, and his was in Carmel by the sea. It was a random summer weeknight, and Leo was driving us from my house in Santa Cruz to his in Carmel, which was about an hour away. Honestly, I liked hanging out at Leo's place more, not just because it was slightly nicer, but because Carmel had a vibe that catered more to people our age. If we weren't on the lookout for a party, we'd be enjoying some drinks on one of the many private beaches that we technically weren't allowed to be on. I could go on about all the things to do down the coast, but for the sake of brevity, I'll get straight to the point. As we were driving, we decided to have a quieter night. No partying or anything wild like we usually did. We both agreed to grab a few beers, roll a joint, and relax on one of the private beaches under the stars. Honestly, it sounded perfect since we'd been partying hard with our other friends, and we desperately needed a break. For those who don't know the layout of Carmel, there's the ocean side and the bay side. Most of the oceanfront beaches have high dunes with a steep drop-off as you approach the water. If you stood at the ocean's edge and looked back, you'd see a sizable hill of sand. After having a few drinks at Leo's place, we grabbed some bikes from his garage and headed toward the beach we'd chosen. For some reason, Leo insisted on going further than I'd ever been before, which I didn't quite get, since all the beaches were essentially the same. I didn't mind a longer bike ride though, so I just went along with it. Eventually, Leo chose a desolate beach at the end of the road where no cars were parked, and all the houses on the street had their lights off. I actually preferred it this way. This was back when weed was still illegal in California, and we weren't too eager to get caught, especially since we also had drinks, despite being only 19. We hid our bikes under some bushes and then made our way toward the beach. The two of us lit our joint and smoked under the stars, the only sound being the gentle waves and the accompanying breeze. The beach seemed to stretch endlessly in both directions, and the sand felt cool beneath our feet. As we drank more, we got progressively drunker, filling the night air with laughter and conversation. Eventually, we just lay back on the sand, gazing up at the star-filled sky in hopes of catching a shooting star. That's when we heard it. I heard it first. It was almost undetectable, a faint metallic buzzing sound, like the hum of large overhead lights in a massive gymnasium. I can't really describe the sound any better. It was a faint metallic buzz that couldn't have possibly come from anything at the beach. I sat up and looked at Leo, and I could tell when he started hearing it too. We both whipped our heads in every direction, scanning the darkness for the source of the noise. Strangely, it was impossible to pinpoint where the sound was coming from. It was just too faint to tell. We started getting freaked out, but we were too scared to move. We assumed that whatever was making the noise would go away, and we wouldn't have to worry about it. There was no way we could be seen from our spot on that beach. It was way too dark, and the sound of the ocean drowned out any noise we might have made. I know it doesn't sound that scary, but I'd be lying if I said my heart wasn't pounding in my chest. The drone continued, and after a few more minutes, Leo gestured for me to follow him. I nodded in agreement. Leaving was definitely the best option. Just like a scene from a movie, the second we stood up, the droning sound jumped from a 1 to a 5. It took every bit of self-control I had not to scream in fear. It wasn't a gradual increase. The sound literally intensified in a split second, and it was definitely coming from our right. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as a wave of fear washed over me, tensing every muscle in my body. We stared into the darkness, but still didn't see anything. Yet the droning was so close now that we instinctively started running toward the dunes. I didn't even know what we were running from. All I knew was that something was seriously wrong, and there was someone or something after us. As we were about halfway to the dunes, I felt Leo's hand firmly grip my shoulder, abruptly stopping me. At first I was confused, but then I saw what he was staring at. I looked up toward the dune and saw it, a dark figure standing motionless at the peak, its arms freakishly long, almost reaching its knees. It was ridiculously tall, and I was shocked by how still it stood. It was truly terrifying. Leo shouted at me, breaking my trance, and we continued running, this time parallel to the beach. We ran to the next dune entrance and sprinted up the slope. As we reached the top, we looked back at where we'd just been. I can still remember the terrifying sight that followed. Not only was the dark figure still on the dune, but there were now 3 or 4 more, standing motionless on the slope, each one seemingly facing us. We didn't have time to go back for our bikes, so we opted to run the entire way home. The next morning, we retraced our steps, but couldn't find the bikes no matter how hard we looked. Maybe they'd been stolen, or maybe whoever or whatever was stalking us the night before had something to do with it. Either way, I've never experienced anything scarier on a beach, and I still struggle to explain most of what happened. The strangest thing is that I've never been able to figure out what the buzzing drone was, and to this day, I haven't heard anything even remotely like it. Beaches have always unnerved me, though it wasn't always this way. My fear stems directly from the experience I'm about to share. As a kid, I loved the coast. I remember eagerly looking forward to weekends when my family would stay at our beach house. Or if I was lucky, they'd let me spend it at my friend Ethan's beach house, which was always a blast. I was 6 years old, and this was one of those memorable summer weekends. Ethan, our other friend, Max, and I were going to spend a few unsupervised days at Ethan's beach house in Newport Beach. Max was a year older than Ethan and me, and he had just gotten his license, so he'd be driving us down in his car. The drive was fantastic. Max was a pretty inexperienced driver, so most of the trip was spent laughing at his swerving and cursing at the road. It was a great time. We reached Newport Beach in good time and immediately moved our stuff from the car to the rooms we'd be staying in. The layout of the house is important to the story, so I'll briefly describe it. There's a front door, a garage door that connects the backyard to the front yard, a sliding back door, and an upstairs deck that connects the bedrooms. There's also a spiral staircase that allows you to go directly from the deck to the ground level, so you can enter and exit the house from upstairs. The house sits along a canal, meaning the back of the house faces a narrow waterway with houses on the opposite side. We were at that age where chasing girls was a top priority, and having a beach house all to ourselves was the perfect opportunity. We spent a few hours figuring out which girls were at the shore that weekend and talked to them on social media. Eventually, we found a group of 3 cute girls who were down to come hang out at Ethan's house. I had more than enough weed to last the weekend, and we had snagged a few bottles of our parents' alcohol before leaving. It was perfect. Everything was going great. The 3 girls, Emma, Lily, and Kate, were fun and flirty, and it was clear where the night was heading. At one point, the 6 of us decided to smoke in Ethan's backyard pool. It was small, but perfect for 6 tipsy teens. I remember the scene vividly, the gentle ocean breeze blowing through my hair, the steam from the heated water rising with the smoke from our joints. At that age, this was pure bliss. But then suddenly, Ethan turned the music way down and stared over my shoulder into the darkness of the canal. Confused, I turned around and peered into the night. I could barely make out the houses across the canal, but I couldn't tell what Ethan was looking at. One of the girls asked why he turned the music down, and he whispered that he saw someone standing on the dock opposite the house. I figured he was messing with us, so I started laughing. "Who cares, man? People literally live here," I said. Ethan shook his head. "I know that family personally. My parents said they're in Hawaii for the week. Honestly, I still thought he was either joking or overreacting, so I kept chuckling. The girls, however, were a little freaked out and said they wanted to go back inside. I wasn't going to argue, so the 6 of us started making our way out of the pool. As we were drying off in the yard, Max suddenly jumped and cursed, staring toward the canal. The rest of us turned to look, and even though the light was dim, I could definitely see movement on the opposite dock. The 6 of us froze, trying to get a better look at what we were seeing. Just then, a passing car on the road across from us illuminated the scene slightly, and the sight was terrifying. 4 tall silhouettes stood at the edge of the dock, facing us. It was impossible to tell what they were wearing or what they looked like, but there was no doubt they were staring in our direction. "Get inside now," Ethan said, his voice trembling as he motioned toward the sliding door. As we rushed inside, I heard a distinct sound that remains the most terrifying noise I've ever heard. 4 consecutive splashes echoed from behind us. Those figures were swimming across the canal toward us. We were in full-on panic mode at that point. The girls screamed while Max slammed the sliding door shut and locked it. Ethan quickly ran to the front to lock that door too, and the 6 of us huddled in a room that wasn't visible from the outside. We waited in silence, terrified of what we might hear next. A few minutes passed, still nothing. Suddenly, Max cursed, revealing that he had forgotten to lock the sliding door on the deck. Ethan started to panic, realizing that the house was about to be broken into. Just then, we heard soft, quiet footsteps above us, and that was the final straw. None of us had any weapons, and we were all too intoxicated to think clearly, so running was really our only option. The 6 of us bolted for the front door and sprinted to the car, which Max started up in a flash. The chaos was too much for Max to handle, and he ended up smashing into Ethan's mailbox on the way out of the driveway. Once we were far enough away, we called the police. The whole ordeal was a nightmare. We returned to the house once the police had searched it, but the news was devastating. All the valuables on the top floor were gone, but that wasn't the worst part. Ethan's family owned a medium-sized Boston whaler boat, which was also missing, most likely used as the getaway vehicle. Ethan's father usually kept a spare set of keys in a small hatch under the steering wheel, which the police concluded was how the thieves escaped so quickly. How they knew where the key was hidden is something I still wonder about. The police were never able to catch the perpetrators and likely never will. Ethan, Max, and I believe that whoever robbed the house must have known Ethan's family and knew the house was supposed to be vacant that weekend. It's been a long time since that chilling event took place, but I haven't let a day go by without locking every door and window in my home. Do yourself a favor and lock your doors at night.